It was the autumn of 1983, in Dorchester County, Maryland. The air, thick with the scent of salt marsh and decaying leaves, carried the first true chill of the season. For Silas Blackwood, this time of year was a period of accounting, a quiet summation of the year's labor measured in bales of hay, bushels of corn, and the heft of his cattle. He was a man of 71 years, and his movements were as deliberate as the turning of the seasons on the 200 acres his family had worked since the Reconstruction. His face was a map of his life, etched by sun and wind, the lines around his eyes deepening not from worry, but from decades of looking out over his fields, squinting into the rising sun. The farm was his life, but it was also a closed ledger. He owed no man and no bank. The land, the house, the barn, the equipment, it was all his. This solvency was a point of quiet, deeply held pride, a legacy from his father, who had preached the gospel of self-reliance with the fervor of a country parson. His father's words were bedrock: "Debt is a yoke, son. You put it on for a little help pulling, and you spend the rest of your life dragging it." Silas had lived by this creed. He repaired his own machinery, grew his own vegetables, and watched his accounts with the sharp eye of a hawk. This year, however, the ledger was not balancing as it should. The hay fields, his primary source of income beyond the small herd of Hereford cattle, had underperformed again. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, creeping decline, a sickness in the soil that had been worsening for nearly a decade. The alfalfa, once thick and lush, was now sparse. The timothy and orchard grass grew with a tired, yellowish cast. He saw it in the numbers. The bale count per acre was down 15% from 5 years ago, and 25% from the peak years he remembered from his 50s. The protein content, which he had tested at the co-op out of a grim sense of duty, was falling. Buyers who once sought him out were now negotiating harder, pointing to the thinner bales. He stood at the edge of his largest field, a 50-acre expanse that ran down toward the brackish waters of a tributary creek. The soil under his worn work boots was a sandy loam, a type his father had called hungry ground. It was naturally acidic, a common trait on the eastern shore, a constant battle against the land's inclination to turn sour. For generations, the remedy had been simple: lime. Spreading crushed limestone every few years sweetened the soil, raising the pH and unlocking the nutrients the crops needed to thrive. It was a routine agricultural cost, as predictable as seed and fuel. But the cost was no longer predictable. The price of agricultural lime, trucked in from quarries west of the Chesapeake Bay, had nearly tripled in the last 12 years. What was once a manageable expense had become a significant financial burden. The last time he had limed properly, 7 years ago, the expense had consumed nearly all the profit from his hay that year. He had put it off since then, telling himself the soil could wait. He had been wrong. The land did not wait. It simply reverted to its nature. The problem was now a crisis. His soil tests, which he conducted himself with an old but reliable Lamotte kit, showed a pH of 51. Alfalfa, the heart of his best hay, struggled to survive below 60. He was not just losing yield, he was losing the very foundation of his pasture. He did the math in his head. To bring all 120 acres of his hay and pastureland back to a healthy 65 would require nearly 300 tons of lime. The quotes he had gotten from the Southern States Cooperative were staggering. It would cost him more than $10,000. It was a sum he did not have. Taking out a loan for soil amendment felt like a profound failure, a violation of the principle that had guided his entire life. The community knew the struggle. At the feed store in town, the men gathered around the wood stove in winter and the open loading dock doors in summer. Their talk was of crop prices, weather, and the ever-rising cost of inputs. They spoke of the acid soil as a shared enemy. Most of the younger farmers, men in their 40s and 50s, were leveraged. They operated on lines of credit from the bank, their decisions governed by spreadsheets and loan officers. They bought the lime because they had to, rolling the cost into their operating debt and hoping for a good year. They looked at Silas with a mixture of respect and pity. They respected his debt-free status, a relic from another era. They pitied him for the constraints it imposed. They saw his thinning fields and shook their heads. Behind his barn, a monument to a different kind of problem stood silent and immense. It was a mountain of oyster shells, a glistening white mound 20 feet high and 100 feet long. For 50 years, the local cannery, Harrison and Sons Packing, had been dumping its waste shells on a fallow patch of ground at the back of Silas's property. The arrangement had been made between his father and old Mr. Harrison's father. The cannery was a mile down the road. They needed a place to get rid of the shells, and Silas's father had a useless, marshy corner of a backfield. No money exchanged hands. It was a neighborly convenience, a handshake deal that persisted through generations. Trucks would arrive, groan their way down the farm lane, and dump their loads. Over the decades, the pile grew from a small heap into a chalky, miniature mountain. It was a landmark. Children dared each other to climb it. Weeds and tough coastal grasses colonized its base. In the summer, it shimmered in the heat, a stark white anomaly against the green and brown of the farm. To everyone, it was just that, a pile of trash. An eyesore. A problem of disposal that Silas had inherited. Some at the feed store joked that Silas's biggest asset was the mountain of garbage behind his barn. They wondered aloud what it would cost to have it all hauled away. The number was always comically large. Silas, however, saw something different. He did not see a pile of trash. He saw a pile of calcium carbonate. He saw the very same mineral he was being told to buy at an exorbitant price. The thought had been with him for years, a quiet seed planted long ago by his father. Now, with the financial pressure mounting, that seed was beginning to germinate. He knew what the agronomists would say. He knew what the men at the feed store would say. But he also knew what his father had taught him. He knew the land, and he knew the sea, and he remembered the lessons about how the two were connected. The crisis in his fields was forcing him to consider an old, almost forgotten path. A path that led directly to the shimmering white mountain behind his barn. The new county extension agent, a young man named Arthur Davies, arrived in a gleaming white Ford pickup with the university logo on the door. He was in his late 20s, earnest and full of a confidence that came from a recent master's degree in soil science. He wore crisp khaki pants, a polo shirt, and carried a stainless steel clipboard. He represented the modern face of agriculture, a world of data, chemical analysis, and precise, science-based recommendations. Davies had called a week earlier to introduce himself, offering a free consultation as part of his outreach to local farmers. Silas had agreed, mostly out of a sense of detached curiosity. He wanted to see what the new science had to say, even though he suspected he already knew. He met Davies at the head of the lane and walked with him out to the 50-acre field. Davies was methodical. He unpacked a chrome-plated soil probe, a GPS unit, and a bag of plastic sample containers. He walked a prescribed W pattern across the field, taking 20 core samples, his movements efficient and practiced. He talked as he worked, his voice full of the easy authority of his training. He spoke of cation exchange capacity, buffer pH, and the nutrient uptake channels of Medicago sativa. Silas listened quietly, nodding now and then. He did not need the technical jargon to understand his problem. He could see it in the pale color of the grass. He could feel it in the hard, compacted soil. He could smell it in the sour, metallic tang the earth gave off after a rain. He had known this field his entire life, had walked it thousands of times. He knew its low spots that held water, its sandy ridges that dried out first. Davies's GPS unit was mapping the field's topography, but Silas held a more detailed map in his memory, one drawn by decades of observation. Back at the barn, Davies performed a preliminary field test for pH using a digital meter. He swirled a soil slurry in a small beaker, his brow furrowed in concentration. The meter's display settled on a number. 5.17, Davies announced, as if revealing a novel discovery. That's your problem right there. It's critically low. I'm surprised you have any alfalfa left at all. The aluminum toxicity at this level must be significant. Silas simply nodded. It's sour, he said. Davies gave a tight, professional smile. That's one word for it. Based on the soil type, a Matapeake sandy loam, and these readings, you're going to need a significant amendment. I'll run the full analysis back at the lab, but my preliminary recommendation is 2.5 tons of pelletized dolomitic lime per acre. Applied this fall, so it has the winter to work into the soil profile. He punched numbers into a calculator on his clipboard. For this 50-acre field, that's 125 tons. For all your hay ground, you're looking at close to 300 tons. He looked up at Silas, his expression shifting to one of sympathetic concern. It's a major investment, I know. But frankly, you can't afford not to do it. Your yields will just keep dropping until these fields are non-productive. It was at that moment that one of the cannery's old dump trucks rumbled past the barn, heading for the shell pile. The truck, a 1960s-era International Harvester, labored up the slight incline, its engine groaning, and disappeared behind the barn. A moment later came the loud, cascading crash of several tons of oyster shells being dumped. Davies flinched at the sound. He looked toward the back of the barn. What was that? Harrison's, Silas said. Dumping shells. Davies's gaze followed the truck as it reappeared, now empty, and headed back down the lane. He peered around the corner of the barn and saw the white mountain for the first time. His professional composure slipped for a moment. His mouth hung slightly open. Good Lord, he said. What is all that? Oyster shells, Silas replied, his voice flat. From the cannery. They've been dumping them there since before I was born. Davies walked toward the pile, his khaki pants brushing against the tall weeds. He looked at it with a mixture of awe and professional disgust. He saw a massive, unregulated solid waste disposal site. He saw a potential environmental liability. He saw a colossal nuisance. He picked up a half shell, its edges sharp, its nacreous interior catching the afternoon light. He rubbed his thumb over its rough, chalky exterior. This is all calcium carbonate, you know, he said, stating the obvious. Chemically, it's the same as limestone. He paused, then tossed the shell back onto the pile. But it's useless in this form. The particle size is enormous. It would take a century for it to break down and have any meaningful effect on soil pH. The surface area is practically 0-inch. He turned back to Silas, a look of pity on his face. It's ironic, isn't it? You're sitting on a mountain of calcium, and you still have to buy lime. Silas looked from the young man to the pile of shells, then back again. He had heard this argument before, in a less formal way, from others. It was the conventional wisdom, the textbook answer. He thought about his father. He thought about the hungry ground. What if a man was to grind it up? Silas asked. The question was quiet, almost hypothetical. Davies laughed. It was not a mean laugh, but a dismissive one, the laugh of a teacher correcting a naive student. Grind it up? With what? You'd need an industrial rock crusher. The energy cost alone would be more than buying bagged lime. And even then, you wouldn't get it fine enough. For lime to be effective, it needs to be pulverized to a fine powder, at least a 100 mesh screen. These shells, they are tough. It's not practical. It's a nice idea, a sort of closed-loop system, but the science and the economics just aren't there. He gestured back toward the field. Your best bet, Mr. Blackwood, is to bite the bullet. Get a loan, buy the pelletized lime. It's uniform, it spreads easily, and it goes to work fast. In 2 years, your yields will be back up, and you'll be able to pay off the note. He patted his clipboard. The numbers work. I'll send you the full report. Silas watched the young agent walk back to his shiny truck. He heard the certainty in his voice, the unshakable faith in his data and his training. Davies saw a problem and a solution, all contained on his clipboard. He did not see the 50 years of history in the shell pile. He did not see the quiet desperation of a man who refused to go into debt. He saw a stubborn old farmer and a pile of trash. A week later, at the Taylor's Bridge Feed and Grain, the story had already made the rounds. Davies had mentioned his visit to Silas's farm to the store owner, and the news spread like spilled seed. When Silas went in to buy a bag of mineral salt for his cattle, the usual morning gathering of farmers was there. Heard the new county man was out to your place, Si, said Frank Parkey, a dairy farmer from down the road. Silas nodded, hefting the 50-pound bag onto his shoulder. He was. Told you what we all know, I expect, said another man, leaning against a stack of feed sacks. Need to spend some money on that ground of yours. He suggested lime, Silas said simply. Frank Parkey chuckled. Heard you asked him about grinding up those oyster shells, the men around him grinned. The image was absurd to them. Silas, out there with a hammer, trying to turn a mountain of shells into dust. He said it wouldn't work, Silas stated, neither embarrassed nor defensive. It was a fact, like the price of the salt block. Well, of course it won't work, Parkey said, his tone softening with a touch of patronizing kindness. He's got a master's degree, Si. He knows his chemistry. It's a shame, all that stuff sitting there, but it's just trash. You'd be better off trying to get the cannery to pay you to haul it away. The men nodded in agreement. They were not trying to be cruel. They were reinforcing a shared reality. In their world, solutions to farm problems came in bags and barrels, delivered by trucks, paid for with checks or credit. The idea of creating a solution from waste, using decades-old machinery and one's own labor, was a foreign concept. It was the kind of thing their grandfathers might have tried, but it had no place in the modern, economic reality of 1983. They saw Silas as a man stuck in the past, his pride preventing him from making a sound business decision. They saw his farm, his independence, slowly crumbling, and they pitied him for it. Silas paid for his salt, nodded to the men, and walked out into the cool autumn air. Their voices, their certainty, their pity, none of it touched him. He was listening to a different voice, a memory from a long time ago. The dismissal from the expert and the mockery from his neighbors did not deter him. They solidified his resolve. They had all looked at the shell pile and seen a problem. Silas, and perhaps only Silas, was beginning to see the solution. That evening, Silas did not sit in his armchair with the newspaper as he usually did. Instead, he went to the roll-top desk in the small room he used as an office. The desk had been his father's. From a deep lower drawer, he pulled out a stack of old farm ledgers, their cardboard covers softened with age, their pages filled with his father's precise, angular handwriting. These books were a detailed history of the farm, chronicling yields, expenses, and weather for over 40 years. He was not looking for numbers. He was looking for a specific memory, a confirmation of something he had carried in his mind for half a century. He leafed through the ledger for 1947, then 1948. The pages smelled of old paper and dust. His father, John Blackwood, had been a man of observation and quiet experimentation. He trusted his own eyes over most other sources of information. And there it was. An entry from August 1948. The cannery had just begun dumping shells the year before. The pile was still just a small heap. His father's entry was not long, but it was clear. Ground a barrow full of the Harrison shells with the old hammer mill, the entry read. Screened it through a quarter-inch hardware cloth. Coarse stuff. Put it on the west end of the kitchen garden, where the tomatoes always yellow. The soil there is tired and sour. We will see. Silas ran his finger over the faded ink. The memory attached to the words was vivid. He had been a young man then, just 26, home from the war for 3 years. He remembered his father, a man then in his late 50s, wrestling with the heavy, belt-driven hammer mill, dragging it out from the back of the implement shed. He remembered the deafening racket it made, the sharp, mineral smell of the pulverized shell, the white dust that covered everything. He had asked his father why he was bothering with it. We can buy lime, Silas had said. His father had shut down the tractor that powered the mill and wiped his brow with a dusty forearm. He looked at Silas, then at the small pile of grayish-white powder he had created. The sea and the land are in a constant argument, his father had said. It was the way he often spoke, in simple, powerful metaphors. The sea gives the oyster a house of stone to protect it. The oyster dies, and the house is left over. The land, our land here, is tired. It's given up too much. It's gone sour with the effort. He scooped up a handful of the ground shell. It was a mix of fine powder and small, gritty fragments. This is the Oyster's house. It's made of the same stuff as the limestone hills over in the valley. But the sea made this. It's full of other things, too. Little bits of everything the water holds. He let the material run through his fingers. Waste is just a resource you haven't understood yet. The Cannery thinks this is trash. Maybe they are right. Or maybe it's the land's medicine, and they are just delivering it to our door. That was the core principle. The simple, foundational truth that Silas had carried with him ever since. Waste is just a resource you haven't understood yet. His father had not been a scientist. He had no degrees. But he had a profound, intuitive understanding of the cycles of the natural world. He saw the farm not as a factory, but as a living system, with inputs and outputs that could be balanced if one was patient and observant enough. Silas turned the page in the ledger. A few months later, another entry, dated October 1948, the tomatoes on the west end held on longer than the others. Less blight. The soil there looks darker. The beans I planted after came up strong. The shell powder works. It is slow, but it is sure. There it was. The proof. A single, successful experiment on a 10 by 10 foot patch of garden soil, recorded in a dusty ledger 35 years ago. His father had never expanded the experiment. The price of lime was cheap back then. The hammer mill was old and cantankerous. It was easier to just buy what was needed. The knowledge was proven, and then set aside, filed away for a time when it might be needed. Silas closed the ledger. That time was now. The economic conditions had changed, but the chemistry of the soil and the shells had not. The core principle remained true. The physical manifestation of this knowledge was not just in the old book. It was out in the barn, buried under a pile of old tarps and lumber. The hammer mill. A New Holland Model 77, bought used by his father in the late 1930s. It hadn't been run in at least 30 years. It was a relic, a piece of antique farm equipment. To Arthur Davies, it would be a joke. To the men at the feed store, it would be a fool's errand. To Silas, it was the key. It was the tool that could turn a mountain of waste into a field of medicine. It was the physical link between his father's wisdom and his own present crisis. He did not need a loan officer or a spreadsheet. He had a memory, a ledger, and a very old machine. The path forward was clear. It would be slow. It would be loud. It would be dusty. But it would be his. The decision was made. It settled in him not with a jolt of excitement, but with the quiet gravity of a stone finding its place at the bottom of a pond. He would not call Mr. Davies to tell him he was rejecting his advice. He would not announce his intentions at the feed store. He did this quietly. His work was his own, and the results would speak for themselves, or they would not. The first task was to resurrect the hammer mill. It sat in the dark, a corner of the main barn, a place where old, superseded equipment went to await a final, unlikely call to service. It was buried under a collapsed stack of oak planks, several desiccated tarpaulins, and a thick blanket of dust and cobwebs. It took him the better part of a morning just to excavate it, using a crowbar to lever the heavy planks aside. Finally, it stood revealed. The New Holland Model 77 was a simple, brutal machine, built from heavy-gauge steel and cast iron. It was painted a faded red, now mostly obscured by rust and grime. It consisted of a main grinding chamber, a feed hopper on top, and a large pulley wheel on the side, designed to be driven by a flat belt from a tractor's PTO pulley. It was seized solid. The main shaft, which held the rotating hammers, would not turn. The auger at the bottom, meant to carry the ground material out, was frozen in its channel. Silas was a mechanic born of necessity. On a farm like his, if you could not fix your own equipment, you could not afford to operate. He looked at the hammer mill not as a single, broken object, but as a system of parts. He began the slow, methodical process of disassembly. He used penetrating oil, a heavy wrench, and a brass hammer. He worked with a patient, focused intensity. The nuts and bolts were rusted tight, fused by decades of damp and disuse. He would douse a bolt with penetrating oil, tap it sharply with the hammer to break the seal of the rust, and then apply slow, steady pressure with the wrench. Sometimes the bolt would groan and turn. Sometimes the head would shear off, and he would have to use a drill and an extractor bit, a task he performed with surgical precision. Each part removed was a small victory. He took the bearing housings apart. The old grease inside had hardened into a waxy, black substance like tar. The bearings themselves, heavy steel rollers, were pitted with rust. They were unsalvageable. He carefully measured their dimensions with a pair of calipers and wrote the numbers down in a small, all-stained notebook. He would have to order new ones. He unbolted the grinding chamber. Inside, the free-swinging hammers, thick plates of hardened steel, were caked with a solidified mass of what looked like old corn cobs and rust. He used a chisel and hammer to break them free. The screen at the bottom of the chamber, a perforated plate that determined the size of the final product, was the biggest problem. It was a coarse screen, with half-inch holes, suitable for cracking corn. For grinding shells into a fine powder, it was useless. He would need a much finer screen, something the machine was never designed for. For 2 weeks, the corner of the barn became his workshop. He disassembled the entire machine, down to its last cotter pin. The steel frame he wire brushed down to bare metal and painted with a coat of rust-inhibiting red primer. The parts were laid out on a canvas top in the order he had removed them. He cleaned every piece, soaking the smaller ones in a bucket of kerosene, scraping the larger ones with a putty knife and wire brush. He was not just repairing a machine, he was learning it, understanding its logic, its strengths, and its weaknesses. Finding parts for a 50-year-old machine was a challenge. The local tractor supply store had nothing. The New Holland dealership barely recognized the model number. Silas turned to older methods. He drove to a farm scrapyard 2 counties over, a sprawling field of mechanical skeletons. He spent a whole day walking the rows of rusting combines and balers, looking for anything that might fit. He found a set of bearings from an old silage chopper that matched his measurements. He paid the yard owner $5 for them. The screen was the critical piece he could not find. No standard agricultural screen was fine enough. He needed something with holes no larger than 1/8 of an inch, preferably smaller. After several dead ends, he found his solution in an unexpected place, a marine supply catalog. He ordered a sheet of heavy-duty, 316 stainless steel perforated plate, the kind used for industrial filtration. It had 3 32-inch holes. It was expensive, more than he had wanted to spend, but it was essential. When it arrived, he had to cut it to size with a grinder and drill new mounting holes to fit the hammermill's frame. It was a difficult, painstaking job that took him an entire afternoon. Slowly, he began to reassemble the machine. The newly painted frame. The cleaned and oiled auger. The gleaming new bearings, packed with fresh grease. The polished main shaft. The refurbished hammers, their edges sharpened on his bench grinder. Finally, the new stainless steel screen, bolted into place at the bottom of the grinding chamber. He installed a new, heavy-duty flat belt on the pulley. The machine looked transformed. It was no longer a piece of junk. It was a tool, ready for work. The final piece of the puzzle was power. The hammermill needed to be driven by a tractor with a belt pulley, a feature that had been obsolete for 30 years. But Silas had the perfect tractor for the job, his 1952 Farmall Super M. It was not his primary tractor, but he kept it in perfect running order for tasks like running the grain auger or the old cordwood saw. It was a machine from the same era as the hammermill, a simple, reliable engine he knew inside and out. He backed the Farmall into position, lining its belt pulley up with the hammermill's. He wrestled the heavy, stiff canvas belt onto the wheels, setting the correct tension. The whole setup looked like a museum exhibit, a demonstration of antiquated farming technology. He double-checked everything. The grease fittings. The belt tension. The clearance of the hammers. He filled a bucket with oyster shells from the edge of the great pile. They were whole and clattered loudly as he poured them into the feed hopper. He took a deep breath. He climbed onto the seat of the Farmall, set the throttle to a low idle, and engaged the PTO. The flat belt began to slap and turn. The large pulley on the hammer mill started to rotate, slowly at first, then faster. The main shaft spun, and the hammers inside the chamber began to whirl with a low whoosh. The entire machine vibrated, a low hum that resonated through the barn floor. Silas increased the throttle on the tractor. The hum grew into a roar. The hammers were now a blur of motion, a vortex of kinetic energy. He opened the slide gate at the bottom of the hopper. The shells dropped into the chamber. The roar was instantly joined by a deafening, percussive crash, a sound like a rock slide in a steel drum. The whole machine shuddered violently. The farmall's engine strained under the load, its exhaust barking. Dust, a fine white powder, erupted from every joint and seam of the mill. Silas watched the output shoot at the bottom of the machine. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a trickle began. A grayish-white stream of granular material, pouring onto the concrete floor. He shut down the tractor and walked over to inspect it. He knelt and scooped up a handful. It was not a uniform powder like bagged lime. It was a mix. Some of it was a fine, flour-like dust that clung to his fingers. Some of it was coarser, like sand. And there were small, gritty fragments, the size of a pinhead. Arthur Davies would have called it inconsistent, a product of poor quality control. But Silas saw it differently. He saw what his father had seen. The fine powder would go to work quickly, neutralizing the acid in the topsoil. The coarser sand and grit would break down more slowly, over years, a long-term, slow-release source of calcium. It was not a quick fix. It was a lasting cure. He smiled. It was a small, tight smile of pure satisfaction. The kind of smile a man has when he has solved a difficult problem with his own hands and his own mind. The noise had been tremendous, the dust was everywhere, but it had worked. The principle was sound. The machine was capable. The mountain of waste was now a mine of resources. The process of grinding was a campaign, not a single battle. It was a slow, arduous, and monumentally noisy undertaking. Silas dedicated the next month to the work. He could only do it in stretches of a few hours at a time. The physical toll was significant, and the mental fatigue from the constant, deafening roar was immense. He wore heavy leather gloves, safety glasses, and a respirator mask to protect himself from the sharp shell fragments and the abrasive dust. His process became a rhythm. He would start the day by using his old Farmall H tractor, fitted with a front-end loader, to scoop a ton or two of shells from the main pile. He would dump them near the barn, creating a smaller, accessible supply for the day's work. The shells were not clean. They were mixed with decades of accumulated dirt, sand, and organic matter. Some were blackened with age, others still held the iridescence of their recent life in the bay. Then he would start the grinding operation. The Farmall Super M would be chugging away, its engine governed at a steady speed, turning the flat belt that powered the hammer mill. The sound was a constant presence, a mechanical drone that filled the farm. He would shovel the shells into the hopper, a scoop at a time, carefully regulating the flow. Too fast, and the mill would choke, the engine would bog down, and the belt would squeal in protest. Too slow, and the hammers would spin ineffectively, wasting fuel. He learned the machine's appetite, the precise rate at which it could consume the tough, abrasive shells. The noise of the grinding itself was extraordinary. It was not a smooth, continuous sound, but a chaotic, violent series of impacts, thousands of hammer blows per second shattering the crystalline structure of the shells. It echoed across his fields. He knew his nearest neighbors, half a mile away, could hear it, a strange, industrial clamor emanating from the quiet Blackwood farm. The dust was the biggest challenge. It was a fine, pervasive powder of calcium carbonate and silica. It coated everything in the barn with a ghostly white film. It worked its way into his clothes, his hair, the creases of his skin. At the end of each session, he would emerge from the barn looking like a baker who had fallen into a bin of flour. He had to be meticulous about cleaning the respirator and his glasses. He organized the output. At first, he simply let the ground material pile up on the floor. But he soon realized he needed a way to store and handle it. He collected old feed sacks and began bagging the product. Each bag held about 50 pounds of the ground shell. He would fill a bag, tie it off with twine, and stack it on a wooden pallet. The work was repetitive and physically demanding. Shovel shells, bag powder, stack bags. Over and over. Each pallet held 40 bags, a ton of finished material. His neighbors and the folks in town certainly noticed. The sound of the hammer mill carried on the autumn air. Frank Parkey drove past one afternoon and saw Silas, covered in white dust, wrestling a bag of the ground shell. He slowed his truck, shook his head, and drove on. The consensus at the feed store was that old Silas had finally cracked. He was wasting the last good days of autumn on a fool's project, making a tremendous amount of noise and dust for nothing. They imagined him out there, a modern Don Quixote tilting at a mountain of shells with a rusty piece of machinery. Arthur Davies, the county agent, heard about it too. He was making a follow-up visit to a farm down the road and heard the strange, rhythmic crashing sound. He asked what it was. "That's just Cy Blackwood," the farmer told him, a grin on his face. "He's grinding up those oyster shells, just like he told you. Been at it for weeks." Davies felt a pang of professional pity. He had given the man sound, scientific advice, and it had been utterly ignored. Instead, the old farmer was engaged in this performance of obsolete agriculture. Davies made a mental note to drive by. He felt a certain responsibility, a need to see the folly for himself. He drove his white Ford truck down Silas's lane a few days later. He parked at a distance and watched. He saw the old farm tractor, the long flat belt, the vibrating, dust-spewing hammer mill. He saw Silas, a stooped figure in the barn's shadow, methodically shoveling shells. It was, from Davies's perspective, a perfect tableau of inefficiency. The fuel consumption of that old tractor must be enormous. The labor was back-breaking. And the end product, he was certain, would be a coarse, low-grade material that would barely affect the soil. He shook his head and drove away, his initial assessment confirmed. The old man was stubborn, lost in a world that no longer existed. It was a sad sight. He resolved to use Silas Blackwood as a case study in his presentations, anonymously, of course. A cautionary tale about the dangers of rejecting modern agricultural science in favor of folklore and nostalgia. Silas was aware of the scrutiny. He saw the truck slowing down on the road. He saw the glances from his neighbors. He did not care. He was not performing for an audience. He was engaged in a dialogue with his land, his father's memory, and the physical reality of the task at hand. His focus was on the work. He measured his progress in pallets of bagged material. By the first week of November, he had ground nearly 30 tons. It was a fraction of what he needed, but it was enough for a start. It was enough for the 50-acre field. He decided to apply it before the winter rains set in. The application was another challenge. The ground shell was not pelletized. It would not flow easily through a modern spinner spreader, which was designed for uniform granules. It would clog and bridge. Once again, Silas turned to his collection of old equipment. In the back of another shed, under a canvas shroud, was a Gandy drop spreader. It was a simple, 10-foot-wide implement with a long hopper. A series of adjustable openings in the bottom of the hopper, the rake controlled by a lever, would drop the material straight down onto the ground. It was designed for precision, not for speed. It was considered obsolete because it was so slow. For Silas and his non-uniform material, it was perfect. He spent a day cleaning and calibrating it. He hitched it to his farm all-H. The process of spreading was as slow and methodical as the grinding. He filled the hopper with the ground shell, a bag at a time. He drove back and forth across the 50-acre field, his eyes fixed on the marker on the edge of the spreader to ensure a slight overlap on each pass, leaving no gaps. The white powder settled on the dormant brown grass and the dark soil. It looked like a light dusting of snow. He was applying it at a rate of 2.5 tons per acre, the same rate Davies had recommended for the commercial lime. But his material was different. He knew it. As he drove, he could see the mixture of fine dust and coarser granules blanketing the field. It took him 3 full days to cover the 50 acres. When he was done, the field had a pale, ghostly appearance. It was a visible testament to his labor. He had taken a portion of the waste pile, transformed it with his own hands and obsolete machinery, and returned it to the soil from which it had indirectly come. The cost had not been in dollars, but in time, sweat, and diesel fuel. It was a cost he could afford. He cleaned his equipment, stored it away, and waited. The work was done. Now it was up to the rain, the soil, and time. The winter was cold and wet, as it often was on the eastern shore. The rains came, slow, soaking drizzles that lasted for days, and occasional downpours that turned the fields to mud. Silas watched from his kitchen window as the water worked the ground shell into the soil. The pale white cast on the 50-acre field slowly vanished, washed into the topsoil. Outwardly, the field looked no different from any other dormant hayfield in the county. The talk at the feed store had died down. Silas's project was old news, a brief curiosity that had passed. The consensus remained that he had wasted his time, but there was nothing more to say about it until the spring, when the results, or lack thereof, would become apparent. Silas himself was patient. He had done the work. He had followed his father's principle. He trusted the process. Spring arrived late that year, with a series of cold snaps that held back the green. But by mid-April, the land began to awaken. The trees budded, and the first hints of green appeared in the pastures. Silas began to walk his fields daily, a habit as ingrained as drinking his morning coffee. He paid special attention to the 50-acre test field. The first sign was subtle. It was not in the grass itself, but in the clover. His hay mix was a blend of orchard grass, timothy, and red clover. Clover, a legume, is particularly sensitive to soil pH. In the other fields, the clover was struggling to emerge, its first leaves small and yellowish. But in the treated field, the clover was coming up thick and vigorous. The leaves were a deep, healthy green, and they were noticeably larger. He knelt down, his old knees protesting, and examined the plants. He could see the difference clearly. He walked to the edge of the field, where a stark line was visible. On one side of the line, in the untreated headland, the clover was sparse and pale. On the other side, where the drop spreader had begun its work, the clover was a dense, lush carpet. It was an undeniable, visible boundary between failure and success. As the weeks went on, the difference became more pronounced. The grasses, the timothy and orchard grass, began to surge. Their color was a richer, darker green than in his other fields. The growth was denser. By mid-May, the 50-acre field was visibly outperforming the rest of his farm. The hay stood taller, thicker. It looked like the fields he remembered from his youth. The change was so dramatic that it began to attract attention again. Frank Parkey, driving his dairy cows to a new pasture that bordered Silas's land, stopped his truck and stared. He could see the line from the road, a clear demarcation of health and vigor. He had farmed his whole life. He knew what he was looking at. He was looking at a field with perfect fertility. Arthur Davies saw it too. He was on his way to another farm when he passed Silas's place. The sight of the 50-acre field made him slow his truck to a crawl. He pulled over onto the shoulder. He remembered his assessment from the previous fall. He remembered the pity he had felt. He was looking at something that his science, his training, had told him was impossible. He got out of his truck and walked to the fence line, his polished work shoes sinking slightly into the soft dirt. He was a scientist. He believed in data, in observable phenomena. And the phenomenon in front of him was irrefutable. The field was thriving. It was, without a doubt, the healthiest-looking hayfield he had seen in the entire county that spring. He felt a strange, unsettling emotion. It was a mixture of astonishment and a nascent, uncomfortable sense of humility. His confident predictions, his spreadsheets, his chemical analysis, they had all pointed to failure. He had dismissed the old man's plan as foolishness. But the evidence was right there, growing in the sun. He had been wrong. The thought was so foreign to his professional mindset that it was disorienting. He stood at the fence for a long time, looking at the field, the clipboard in his hand suddenly feeling heavy and useless. The climax of the experiment came in the first week of June, the traditional time for the first cutting of hay. Silas oiled and greased his old New Holland haybine, a machine he had owned for 20 years. He sharpened the sickle sections until they were like razors. He began the harvest in the 50-acre field. The cutting itself told the story. In his other fields, the haybine moved easily through the thin growth. But in the treated field, the machine worked hard. The sickle bar was constantly full, the rollers straining to crimp the thick, heavy stems. The sound of the tractor deepened as it powered through the dense crop. Silas had to drive more slowly than he had in years. It was a good feeling, the feeling of a heavy harvest. He let the hay cure in the sun for 3 days, raking it into fluffy windrows with his old side delivery rake. The windrows were thick and high. Then came the baling. He used his trusted International 440 baler, another piece of equipment he had maintained meticulously for decades. The baler plunged through the windrows, eating the hay greedily and spitting out tight, heavy, perfectly shaped bales. He did not need a scale to know the difference. He could feel it in his arms as he stacked the bales on the wagon. They were denser, heavier. A bale from his other fields he could lift to the top of the stack with a single, practiced motion. These bales from the test field required more effort. They were solid, packed with nutrition. But Silas was a man of measure. He did not rely on feeling alone. As he brought the wagons back to the barn, he counted. From the 50-acre field, he harvested 3,052 bales. His average for that field over the past 5 years had been around 2,200. It was a yield increase of nearly 40%. He took one of the new bales and one from a cutting he had bought from a neighbor and placed them on the old platform scale in the barn. A bale from the test field weighed 72 pounds. The neighbor's bale, which was representative of the county average, weighed 58. His hay was not just more plentiful, it was substantially denser. He also took a new soil sample from the middle of the field, using the same simple Lamotte test kit. He mixed the soil with the indicator solution and compared the color to the chart. The previous fall, it had been a distinct yellow-orange, indicating a pH of 51. Now, the solution was a clear, bright green. A pH of 66. In a single winter, his homemade amendment had done exactly what 300 tons of expensive commercial lime was supposed to do. The success was absolute, undeniable, and quantifiable. He had not just raised the pH, he had rejuvenated the soil. The proof was stacked to the rafters in his barn, thousands of heavy, fragrant bales of the best hay he had grown in 20 years. He had done it without a loan, without a single dollar of debt. He had done it with his own labor, with machines others considered scrap, and with a pile of material everyone else considered trash. The quiet satisfaction he felt was profound. It was the feeling of a truth, long held, finally and completely vindicated. A week after the hay was in the barn, the white Ford pickup with the university logo turned into Silas's lane. It drove slowly, as if with hesitation, and parked near the house. Arthur Davies got out. He was not carrying his clipboard. He wore the same khaki pants and polo shirt, but his posture was different. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. Silas was in his workshop, sharpening the blades for his sickle bar mower. He heard the truck arrive and continued his work, drawing a file across the steel with a steady, rasping sound. He did not go out to meet the young man. He let him come to the workshop. Davies appeared in the wide doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. He stood there for a moment, watching Silas work. The air in the shop was cool and smelled of oil and metal filings. "Mr. Blackwood," Davies said. His voice was subdued. Silas finished the blade he was working on, wiped it with an oily rag, and set it aside. He turned to face the county agent. He did not smile. He simply waited. Davies looked down at his shoes for a moment, then met Silas's gaze. "I drove by last week," he said. "I saw the field. And I saw the hay wagons on the road. I stopped at the co-op this morning. They told me you brought a sample of your new hay in for testing." He paused. They said it tested at 18% protein. Nobody in this county is getting 18% protein on their first cutting. Silas nodded slightly, a small acknowledgement of the fact. There was a long silence. Davies seemed to be struggling with what to say next. The easy vocabulary of his profession had deserted him. Finally, he just said it, the words plain and unadorned. "I was wrong," he said. "About the shells. I told you it was impossible. I told you it wouldn't work." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong." It was a simple, direct admission of error. There was no excuse, no attempt to hedge or qualify. For Silas, this was more significant than the increased yield or the pH test results. This was the moment the new world of spreadsheets and data acknowledged the wisdom of the old world of observation and memory. Silas picked up another sickle blade and clamped it in his vise. He was not a man for speeches, and he felt no need to gloat. The work had spoken for itself, and the young man had listened. That was enough. "My father knew," Silas said, his voice as even as ever. He drew the file across the new blade, the sound sharp in the quiet barn. "He tried it, in a small way, a long time ago." Davies stepped further into the workshop, his curiosity now overriding his embarrassment. "But how?" he asked, his voice regaining a touch of its scientific urgency. "My textbooks, my professors, they all said the particle size was the critical factor. They said carbonate in this form, from shells, isn't bioavailable enough. Your ground material, it must have been coarse." Silas stopped his filing. He went to a small bin in the corner where a little of the ground shell remained. He scooped up a handful and held it out for Davies to see. "It is coarse," Silas said. "And it is fine. It is both." Davies looked at the material in Silas's hand. He saw the mix of dust, sand, and grit. He took a pinch between his own fingers, rubbing it. He could feel the fine, floury powder and the sharp edges of the larger particles. And in that moment, he understood. His training had taught him to think in terms of uniformity, of single variables. He had modeled the shells as if they were all large particles. He had failed to consider the effect of a distribution of particle sizes. "The fine dust goes to work right away," Silas explained, his words spare and direct. "It sweetens the top of the soil for this year's crop. The bigger pieces, the grit, they take longer. They will break down next year, and the year after that. It is not like the pellet lime that is gone in 2 seasons. This will feed the soil for 5 years, maybe more. It is slower, but it lasts." He let the shell powder fall back into the bin. "My father said it was the land's medicine. You don't take all your medicine on the first day." Davies was silent. He was processing the information, fitting it into his scientific framework. The old man was describing a time-release mechanism, a concept well known in pharmacology and advanced fertilizer design, but one Davies had never thought to apply to a crude, homemade soil amendment. The varied particle size was not a flaw, it was the key to its effectiveness and longevity. The old farmer and his even older hammermill had created a product more sophisticated than the uniform, pelletized lime Davies had so confidently prescribed. "There are other things in it too," Silas added quietly. "Trace minerals from the bay. Things the land has been missing." Davies nodded, his mind racing. Calcium carbonate was just the beginning. Oyster shells also contain small amounts of magnesium, potassium, zinc, copper, manganese, a whole suite of micronutrients essential for plant health. The commercial lime was pure calcium, sometimes with magnesium if it was dolomitic. But the shells were a complex, organic product. They were returning a piece of the local ecosystem to the soil. The young agent looked from the bin of ground shell to the old man, and for the first time, he saw him not as a relic, but as a repository of a different kind of knowledge. A knowledge that was holistic, patient, and deeply rooted in a specific place. It was a science that predated laboratories and universities, a science based on generations of careful observation. "May I take a sample?" Davies asked. "Of the ground shell, and of the soil from the field?" Silas nodded. "Take what you need." Davies went back to his truck and returned with sample bags, his movements now filled with a new, more humble purpose. He was no longer there to instruct, he was there to learn. He took a bag of the ground shell. He walked with Silas out to the 50-acre field and took new soil cores, his actions now imbued with a sense of discovery rather than routine diagnosis. Before he left, Davies stood by his truck and looked at Silas. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple phrase, but it carried the weight of his entire reversed perspective. He was not just thanking Silas for the samples. He was thanking him for the lesson. Silas simply gave a short, sharp nod and turned back to his workshop. The sound of the file on steel resumed, a steady rhythm of work that needed to be done. Arthur Davies did not bury his mistake. He studied it. He spent the next month in his lab at the county extension office, analyzing the samples from Silas's farm. He ran a full elemental analysis on the ground shell material. He did a particle size distribution analysis. He compared the soil from the treated field with soil from Silas's untreated fields. The data confirmed everything Silas had said and more. The pH change was dramatic. The availability of calcium was high. The levels of key micronutrients, manganese, zinc, and boron, were significantly elevated in the treated soil. The particle size analysis showed a perfect bell curve, with a peak in the fine powder range but with significant amounts of coarser material that would, as Silas had predicted, break down over several years. Davies realized the flaw in his education. It had been theoretical and generalized. It had not accounted for the unique synergies of a local ecosystem, or the ingenuity born of necessity. He had been taught to identify problems and prescribe pre-packaged, industrial solutions. Silas Blackwood had shown him how to find a solution that was already there, hidden in plain sight. He began to write. He scrapped the cautionary tale he had planned to write about the stubborn old farmer. Instead, he wrote a new technical bulletin for the Maryland Cooperative Extension. The title was "The Viability of Crushed Bivalve Shells as a Long-Term Agricultural Liming Agent." It was a dry, scientific title, but the content was revolutionary for his department. He detailed the chemical composition of the shells, the mechanics of the grinding process, and the multi-year, time-release effect of the variable particle size. He included the data from the Blackwood Farm, anonymized as Farm A, Dorchester County, showing the dramatic increase in pH, nutrient availability, and crop yield. He concluded that for farms with access to this waste material, it represented a highly effective, low-cost, and sustainable alternative to commercial lime. He had, in essence, used his scientific vocabulary to translate and validate the folk wisdom of John and Silas Blackwood. He presented his findings at a regional meeting of extension agents. There was skepticism at first. His colleagues were as steeped in the conventional wisdom as he had been. But the data was undeniable. The photographs of the field, the bale counts, the protein analysis, it was a compelling case. He began a new project, an initiative to survey industrial byproducts across the state, crab shells from packing houses, wood ash from lumber mills, compost from municipal facilities, and assess their potential for agricultural use. The single lesson learned in Silas's barn had shifted the direction of his career. He was no longer just a salesman for industrial agriculture, he was becoming a student of sustainable systems. On the Blackwood Farm, a new equilibrium was established. The mountain of shells behind the barn was no longer a monument to waste. It was a resource, a quarry. Silas did not grind shells every day. He had enough material prepared for the next few years. The great, deafening roar of the hammer mill was now heard only for a week or two each autumn, a seasonal chore like putting up storm windows. It was the sound of Silas banking fertility for the future. The other 100 acres of his hayfields were treated over the next 2 autumns. The entire farm underwent a transformation. The yields were consistently high. The health of the soil was palpable. He began to sell his excess hay at a premium. Buyers sought him out, willing to pay more for the heavy, green, high-protein bales that came from the Blackwood Farm. His ledger, once a source of worry, now showed a comfortable profit. He had solved his crisis not by spending money, but by creating value where none was perceived. The old hammer mill, the New Holland Model 77, became the enduring symbol of this transformation. It no longer sat buried in a corner. Silas built a small, dedicated shed for it and the farm all Super M. The two machines, a matched set from a bygone era, were kept clean and ready. They were not antiques to be polished and displayed at a tractor show. They were vital tools, the heart of his farm's newfound prosperity and independence. They represented the timelessness of a good idea and a well-built machine. The story of Silas and the oyster shells became a piece of local lore. The jokes at the feed store had long since faded, replaced by a grudging respect. Other farmers, facing the same economic pressures, began to look at their own situations differently. A few who lived near the water started collecting shells from their shorelines. Another, who lived near a sawmill, arranged to haul away their sawdust and ash to use as bedding and fertilizer. Silas's quiet example had planted a seed, a new way of looking at the connection between waste, resources, and the health of the land. Silas had a grandson, Leo, his daughter's son. The boy was 16 and spent his summers on the farm. Unlike many boys his age, he was quiet and observant. He was not drawn to the new, computerized tractors or the latest chemical trends. He was fascinated by the old ways, by his grandfather's quiet competence. He had watched the entire process of the shell grinding with intense interest, from the resurrection of the hammer mill to the spreading of the final product. He did not ask many questions, but the ones he did were insightful. He wanted to know how Silas knew what size screen to use, how he set the tension on the flat belt, how he could tell by the sound of the engine if the mill was being overloaded. Silas answered him in his usual spare manner, but he took the time to show the boy. He let him help, letting him feel the vibration of the machine, teaching him to read its language. One hot afternoon in August, 2 years after the first field had been treated, Silas was working on the hammer mill, performing his routine maintenance. Leo was there, handing him wrenches. "Grandad," Leo said, "Mr. Davies, the county man, he wrote a whole paper about what you did. It's on the bulletin board at the co-op. He uses a lot of big words, but it's all about your shells." Silas grunted, tightening a grease fitting. He's a smart young man. He learned something. "He says you created a variable rate, time-release soil amendment," Leo said, carefully pronouncing the words he had memorized. Silas paused and looked at his grandson. A rare, small smile touched the corners of his mouth. "My father called it medicine for the land," he said. "I suppose it's the same thing." He handed the grease gun to Leo. "Here," he said. "You do the rest of the fittings. There are 4 on the main shaft and 2 on the auger. You have to make sure you get enough grease in to push the old stuff out. You'll see the black grease come out around the seal. That's how you know you've done it right." Leo took the grease gun. His movements were careful, mimicking his grandfather's. He found the fittings and methodically pumped the fresh, clean grease into the machine's joints. It was not a grand gesture, but it was a significant moment. It was the passing on of a duty, a piece of practical knowledge. Silas was not just teaching the boy how to maintain a machine. He was teaching him the responsibility that came with the knowledge. He was ensuring that the wisdom of his father, tested and proven once again, would not be forgotten when he was gone. Leo was not just an assistant, he was becoming a successor. Years passed. Silas grew older, his movements slower, but his mind remained sharp. The farm remained productive, a green oasis of quiet prosperity. The mountain of shells behind the barn was now less a mountain and more a managed hill, its size rising and falling with the cannery's output and Silas's needs. Arthur Davies eventually moved on to a position at the State University, where he became a leading advocate for sustainable agriculture, always citing the anonymous farmer in Dorchester County who had taught him his most valuable lesson. One evening, Silas sat on his porch, looking out over the fields, now lush and dark in the twilight. The 50-acre field, the first one he had saved, was thick with its second cutting of hay. Leo, now a young man studying agriculture at the local college, sat with him. They sat in a comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who understand each other without the need for many words. The farm was secure. The ledger was balanced. The knowledge was safe. Some things do not become obsolete. They are too simple, too true. They are built of iron and wood and common sense. They are principles, not products. They do not shout for attention or promise instant results. They just wait. They wait for the world to change, for the cost of the new way to become too high, for the easy answers to fail. They wait for someone to remember why they were built, to wipe off the dust, and to put them back to work.